Hello, everybody. Greetings. Welcome to this BioGeometry online foundation training. I'm Chris Attard. I'm going to be your instructor for the training. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for joining this course. I think you're going to find it a very interesting experience. Biogeometry is in itself very fascinating, but more than that, it is also very useful. I'm sure you know this already. You must have done your homework, right? But just to say one other thing, that it's not just useful, I think it is more useful now than it possibly ever could be, because we are going through a time when the stresses of the world are increasing, and especially the amount of stressors, factors around us that cause us stress, what we could call pollution, are increasing. It's not just chemical and biological, it's emotional and especially electromagnetic and a lot of other factors like this. Now, as we're going to go into these lessons, all the lessons are, the pre-recorded lessons are going to be like this, which means they're going to be on video. Then, of course, we will have the live sessions later. That will be on Zoom, but it will be live. But about the pre-recorded sessions, I'd like to make another point on this, please. Do give them the focus that they deserve, because that is going to be the core of how you're going to learn biogeometry. So even though it might be tempting at home to put on a lesson and be doing something else, maybe tending the kids, watching TV, talking with other people, having other people in the room, I would strongly advise you to put aside a time when you don't have any of those things going, when it's just you and the biogeometry. And in that way, you can absorb, have a better learning experience, and the concepts reach you not just at a superficial mental level, but at a deeper level, because they're not difficult concepts, but they are concepts which speak to deep parts of us. Okay. Now, with a video, of course, a recording, you have the benefit that if there's something you don't understand, you can pause, you can rewind, listen to it as many times as you like. And if you still didn't understand something, just remember, make a note of it, and then it will be a question which you can ask in the live session. You can ask me in the live session, or if more better still, email me and I will bring that question, your question, to the live session and answer it for the benefit of everybody. There are some guidelines in the introductory PowerPoint that I sent you on how to do this. Now, the first lesson that we're going to be looking at is lesson 1, but lesson 1 is divided in two. There's 1A and 1B. Lesson 1A is about the projects and research of biogeometry. Now, I know many of you are probably raring to go to learn the techniques, but please do not, I say it again, do not skip out on the theory lessons like this one, because you cannot really learn the practical of a subject until you've learned what it is based on. Otherwise, you'll just be learning techniques very superficially, and you will not get the effect which you are looking for and we are looking for you to learn, okay? Now, lesson 1A is an introduction of biogeometry, just as you would get an introduction. If you went to an event and somebody introduced the keynote speaker, what do they say about them? Well, first of all, they say who they are, but they also say what their accomplishments are, what down the years, what they've done. Now, this is what lesson 1A is. It's the projects and research that have been done, and it's basically going to show you how far biogeometry can go and how far you can take it in your own life. And I think you'll find it whets your appetite a fair bit. Okay, now, before we go into that, speaking of speakers, when I go to even a 1-hour talk somewhere, I like to know who's talking. So obviously you're here for a whole course with me. It's only fair that you know a little bit about me. So here goes. Well, I am from Malta, and I have been a teacher of holistic subjects and metaphysical subjects now for over 20 years. I've conducted seminars in 18 countries, and I would like to say a little bit, although there have been many subjects which I have taught and others which I teach, I have this rule with myself that I only teach things which have worked for me, which I use in my life. Because I like to be in a position where if you ask me a question, I don't want to have to answer it with just knowledge, with just theory, but preferably, where possible, I like to answer it also with experience. So I'm obviously a certified instructor of biogeometry. I was certified by the founder, Dr. Karim himself. You can see that on the screen. That was during my certification in Cairo, Egypt. And since then, I have introduced biogeometry into 8 new countries and counting. Still counting, and some US states as well. Now, there are other subjects I teach. I am also a teacher of sacred geometry and symbols, symbology, and something called the Bazi for pillars, which is a form of Oriental astrology, but it's not really astrology because it uses just the 5 elements in somebody's birth chart to read their destiny. But we're here to talk about biogeometry. So I'm just mentioning these just to give you an idea of the gamut of experience that I've had in other subjects. Another subject that has been very prominent in my story has been intuition training. I've taught this for over 2 decades. I was senior instructor of a system called Mindscape. I wrote the book about it, the Mindscape manual, and trained many instructors as well. Today, I teach my own version called the Intuition Key. I also do a lot of research into the temples of my country, Malta. We can boast here some of the world's oldest standing temples with very interesting energies. Perhaps one day you'll have the occasion to visit Malta in one of the special tours I'm planning to run, and you'll experience them for yourself. Now, I do want to get a little bit into how I met biogeometry. It happened in June 1999 when I was reading the main newspaper of Malta, the Times of Malta, and suddenly this story came in front of me. It said, Egyptian architect says designs can heal the sick. Now, for a long time, ever since I was a child, I had a sense of what one could call sacred geometry even then. I remember actually being in my class at school and the teacher asking us to draw 2 angles to teach us how to use a protractor. Draw a 30-degree angle and next to it a 40-degree angle. And right away I looked at them and I turned to the boy next to me and said, can you feel them? Of course he couldn't, and I learned to shut up about that. But in truth, what I was feeling, sensing as it were, was the unique quality of a 30-degree angle as opposed to the unique quality of a 40-degree angle. Now, this is going to make more sense, especially after lesson 1B. But suffice it to say that then I learned sacred geometry, and I came to a point that when this article opened in front of me, I couldn't believe what I was reading, because here it said, for example, imagine a world where the sick could be healed by geometrical shapes engraved on anything from jewelry to mobile phones. So here was a man who not only had this knowledge of the ancients, sacred geometry and all that, but he had actually formulated it into a practical and workable science. And that was just mind-blowing. And this article continued to extol the virtues of biogeometry, so to speak, with such stories, for instance, as this one. Hisham Fatsuh, a 24-year-old engineering student who had a low platelet count. He had a medical problem. He had already undergone a $25,000 course of treatment in the United States, even had his spleen removed to no avail. So he had nothing to lose and decided to try Dr. Karim's method. And he says, when I first met Ibrahim, he put a ring on my finger with a design print on it. Okay, rings with design print are very common to us today in biogeometry. Then he gave me a medallion. At first I thought it was strange, but after all I had gone through, I was prepared to give it a go. Overnight, his platelet count went up to 35,000, and in 4 more days, it soared to 250,000. Now, claims such as these may seem far-fetched, but believe me, once you learn about biogeometry, you realize that they're not. What this story is referring to is the power of biosignatures. And that is one of the chapters that you will be learning in this course. We have an entire lesson on biosignatures, where you get a collection of biosignatures, probably including the ones that were used in this story, and you learn how to use them. Okay, so we can move on to talk a little bit about Dr. Karim himself before actually going into the lesson, because biogeometry is Dr. Karim. Biogeometry is founded on ancient wisdom. However, it was very skillfully put together by Dr. Karim, that he incorporated not only ancient wisdom, but more recent research of the radiesthesia scientists of the 20th century, who we'll be talking about in the following lessons as well. And he merged all that wisdom, all that knowledge together with modern insight and his own research. So this is Dr. Karim, who you see here. He's a PhD, he's an architect, writer, philosopher, graduated in architecture from the Federal Institute of Technology of Zurich, Switzerland. Professor of architecture, he also was a professor for many people who did PhD projects, as you will see, in the university. He had several advisory positions in ministries, Egypt, of health, culture, tourism, and scientific research. And he was responsible for some very specific projects. One of these being, for example, the restoration of the Museum of Ancient Egyptian Medicine in Cairo. Now, this wasn't just an unusual project. It was to be a very important event also for Dr. Karim, because he was already at the time developing biogeometry. And as he got to learn more about the ancient Egyptian medicine that the museum talked about, there were certain things which even helped him, inspired him in his journey. For example, I remember Dr. Karim saying how in ancient Egypt, for example, they already had brain surgery. They actually already had eye doctors. Wow, but here's the difference. The eye doctors they had, they would have one doctor for the left eye, one doctor for the right eye, because that's the level of sophistication they had. And we're not just talking in medical terms of the different eyes, but also the energetic concepts in terms of the polarization of the two sides of the brain, etc. We will talk a little bit more about that. Now, he has been honored by several institutes for his environmental work, and in 2005 was chosen as Man of the Year by the Swiss magazine Anzeiger for his success in reducing the effects of electrosmog in the villages of Hamburg and Herschel in Switzerland. Now, this is a very important project in biogeometry. It's a project which has been dubbed by people who lived in that village as the Miracle of Hamburg. In a few moments, when we start the lesson, you're going to be seeing it in more detail, and it's very important because it gives us not only hope, but it gives us a sort of a benchmark as to what can be achieved today by biogeometry against one of the factors that is so detrimentally affecting humanity, and that's electromagnetic radiation. So we see that Dr. Karim was the recipient of various other awards. He founded certain organizations, societies, etc. And later on, I'll tell you a story about the last point you see on your screen, how he was given the original materials of renowned radiesthesists. Because it is amazing. It is almost as if this body of knowledge didn't want to just die out into obscurity, but Dr. Karim came to receive, totally in strange synchronistic ways, the research, prototypes, etc. of these radiesthesias. And he could therefore incorporate the key concepts that they used to work on and didn't continue working on, because the work was interrupted for various reasons, into biogeometry today. In fact, today we say that biogeometry starts off, as it were, where radiesthesia finishes. And I'll finish this section about Dr. Karim with a quotation. This is from Ruth Schad, who wrote the booklet, The Miracle of Hamburg, which is about the project in Hamburg. And this is how something that she described about Dr. Karim. She said, "What impresses me most with Ibrahim is his transpersonal love for all living things, the humility towards the wisdom of the power of creation, and his principle of simplicity." Well, I think when you start to learn biogeometry, you're going to really see how biogeometry, Dr. Karim is biogeometry, because some of these principles are precisely what we will be embracing. This is before we go on into the lesson. This is just a photo to give you a sense of the Unity, the sense of camaraderie that there exists in biogeometry. Here we see a picture from the event which took place in Montreal, Canada in 2017, the 45th anniversary of biogeometry. Yes, biogeometry has been around for 45 years. And in the picture you see Dr. Karim's family, instructors, and friends. And with that, we can actually pass to the lesson, the first lesson of today. So, lesson 1A, some of the biogeometry research and projects. And essentially, we're going to be looking briefly at these sections: projects on electromagnetic and mobile radiation, radioactivity, microbiology research, agriculture, animal husbandry, mention of the experiments done with Dr. Masaru Emoto, biogeometry applications in autism and mental stress, an extremely important section, research on reducing electrosmog stress in cars and their drivers, and something about infrared testing in biogeometry. Let's start with the first and possibly one of the most important sections, projects on electromagnetic and mobile phone radiation. Now, here we will be talking about the Hamburg project, which I've already mentioned, some studies, very important and very fascinating studies done on biogeometry and Wi-Fi, and also something which concerns us all about harmonizations in mobile phones. The Hamburg Mobile Communication and Environment Research Project, which took place in Switzerland. This, what you see here, is the village of Hamburg, beautiful village there among the hills and the mountains and surrounded by forests, beautiful place. But they had that problem with electromagnetic radiation, as we are going to see. So first of all, it's worth mentioning that this is an environmental project done with the support of Swisscom, who was the mobile telephony provider, and these authorities within the Swiss government. So it is very important to realize this was not just some isolated project, but actually done under the auspices of Swiss government. It's a very important point there. The objective was to restore the quality of life, namely humans, animals, and plants, affected by electromagnetic radiation from mobile towers, high-tension cables, and other industrial sources. In this case, biogeometry proved to be a very cost-effective solution for protection from low levels of electromagnetic radiation. So how did it all start? Well, it started in November 2002, when the Swiss Ombudsman's Office received a complaint. For those who are not from Europe, the Office of the Ombudsman is a specialized office within the government, and it's in charge of receiving complaints that relate to civic matters or citizens. Okay, now, the Ombudsman was informed that a few months after the commissioning of a mobile communication antenna, inhabitants of Hamburg were complaining of various symptoms, including insomnia, headaches, difficulty concentrating, irritability, changes in behavior, such as conflicts between neighbors, which had never existed before. Now, the pictures we see here, first of all, up here, you see where the mobile antenna was. It was actually placed inside a church steeple. But as you can see, it's smack in the middle of the village there. Now, this is one of the residents showing pictures how during this time, when they were being affected by the radiation from the mobile antenna, the only way she and her husband could sleep was to actually set up bed in the cellar next to the firewood. So they couldn't sleep in their bedroom anymore, but when they slept in their cellar, it was all okay. It may be because obviously being underground, they were less reached by radiation. You may know sometimes you go into a basement and you don't get so much of a mobile signal. And secondly, the presence of the firewood may have also absorbed some of that radiation. Now, the changes in behavior that were happening, the mayor, because obviously the mayor was involved in all this, in this project, he told Dr. Karim how, for example, there were neighbors who had lived next to each other for decades. Nobody had ever argued, but suddenly one person is arguing because the other person is parking his car close to their house, which had never happened before. Symptoms which one might not associate with electrosmog, but we will talk later about this. because when we study the energetic qualities that occur in electrosmog, yes, it can affect the mental and even higher levels of our being, which will result even in changes in our disposition, in our behavior. And in fact, some of what you read here are also very common symptoms in modern society. It was also noted that all breeding birds moved out of the area. Later, this will be an important point, because anytime in biogeometry animals are involved, we actually give it particular attention, because animals cannot be subject to placebo. So you sit up and notice when something happens with animals and nature responds. Okay, well, this is just a sample of some of the media that occurred all throughout, just to show you how much attention in Switzerland this project raised, because the people were complaining, and the fact that afterwards it was solved obviously made more media. You can see the translations here of some of these headings. And along with this lesson, you will also receive links to some videos from YouTube, which are videos from Swiss television, news features showing Dr. Karim, showing Hamburg, interviews with the residents and with Dr. Karim, very interesting to watch, which will give you a basis of this entire project. Well, here we see some pictures. This is Dr. Karim testing one of the residents, showing how the people most affected were by the antenna were what today is termed as electrosensitive. The test he is doing here, where he is using a pendulum, is a test you're going to be learning in a couple of lessons from now. One of the very important techniques we do in biogeometry, where we test people, we test objects, etc. And this is a picture here. This is one of the emitters that you're going to be seeing. It's called the Hamburg emitter today, but it wasn't at the time. And you can see residents were happy to cooperate with Dr. Karim. In fact, somebody here manufactured that stand, a special stand in which one could slot any amount of these emitters in any direction. Now here we see some more pictures. Once again, don't worry about them right now. They don't mean anything to you, but after a couple of lessons, you're going to know exactly what's going on. But these are all examples of biogeometry interventions done in the tower. Okay, especially these strips, we'll be talking about them in detail a lot. They are used to harmonize the electrical supply feeding the antenna. Actually, those of you who by now have received the home kit, you will already see that you have strips like that in the home kit. And yes, you can use them to harmonize your electricity supply in your house as well as your water supply. But let's talk details later, okay? And this is again the Hamburg emitter being fine-tuned by Syed Karim, Dr. Karim's son. And here we see the emitter actually being aimed at the antenna mechanism, because it emits BG3. We're not going to talk in this course much in detail about this emitter, because we deal with it particularly in the advanced. This is the one that I have, the modern version that I have here. Okay, it's called the Hamburg emitter. The reason it's in the advanced, because the fine adjustment of the dial that you see Syed doing it down here is something that calls for a bit of practice. And we can't reasonably expect you to learn the course. You're still learning the basic techniques and being able to achieve the fine tuning that it requires. This is why it's left for the advanced. More pictures, this time about biogeometry interventions that were done in people's houses with these emitters. Because Dr. Karim found an important principle here. You see, when we're talking about electrosmog and electrosensitivity, sorry, we have to consider it's not one single item that causes this. It is a collective of radiation coming from various sources, what in fact we term as electrosmog. So sometimes to treat one particular source of interference, in this case, which was the antenna, it wasn't enough. You would have to treat also other incoming radiation in order to give the body a rest, so to speak, so that it can regenerate and not be affected, bombarded by so many sources. And this is what was done here. These emitters are pointed at distant sources, which you will be seeing in a moment. In fact, here, the picture we see This is one of the residents. He is not a biogeometry practitioner. However, because Dr. Karim left so many of these finely tuned interventions in the houses, it's very straightforward once they're stuck. So Dr. Karim coached people like this man simply how to adjust them if they are ever moved and need adjusting, because the adjusting is about getting them in the exact alignment. And the interesting thing is, instead of using the method you and I would use once you learn the course, which would be with the biogeometry pendulums, he is using actually these two women who are electrosensitive. You can see them with their eyes closed. They could actually feel the incoming radiation. So once he actually gets the emitter pointed exactly at the source of radiation and neutralizing it, they would actually feel it. They'd say, now it feels better. And so he can leave it in the adjustment. That's how effective it was. These, in fact, are distant photos of some of the distant sources. That's how far away they could be. Okay, so if they were affected by sources this far away, imagine how much we are affected today in modern cities where there are antennas and masts everywhere. I will give you a link later so that we don't interrupt the video, but this is a news feature, very interesting, which you should see, that was taken during the project. Now, I already mentioned that this project was done under the auspices of Swiss local government. Well, something that happened before even Dr. Karim was even called in for the project, the authorities had commissioned an independent medical agency of doctors to assess the situation in Hamburg. So these doctors spoke to the people who are affected, and they drew up data in this way. And this graph is a basic representation of that data. And as you can see here, the number of complaints were up to 90. That means that's the number of people who are having problems in this situation. And as you can see, that very few of them, probably about 2 or 3 here, could actually say they were free from symptoms. This was before the intervention of Dr. Karim, but with the antenna. So what you're seeing here is a result of what happened after the antenna was installed. A larger number had mild symptoms, an even larger number had moderate, and very important, look at how many people actually reported severe symptoms. Remember, these are being interpreted by a medical agency, by doctors. Now, after the biogeometry intervention, these doctors assess the situation again to get a comparison. Watch the graph now. This is 2 years later, therefore, the antenna was still functioning, but by that time, biogeometry had been installed, and therefore, people could have had experienced the benefit of biogeometry. These things like this, you obviously have to measure after a certain period of time, not instantaneous. If you look at the graph, it is nothing short of dramatic, because now look how many of them, the vast majority of them, as we see here, 70 people, in fact, reported themselves to be free from symptoms. Another large number mild, a smaller number moderate, and severe. Look how severe has gone down. And most importantly, look how people free from symptoms have gone up. In fact, you could actually look at this graph as a mirror image of before and after. Very, very significant. Then here we have a similar graph, a similar display of data, this time relating specifically to complaints related to the head. Headaches, buzzing in the ears, etc. And once again, we see in 2002, without the biogeometry, but with the antenna, nobody said that they were free of symptoms. Everybody had some problem going on in with their head. Mild, moderate, but a large number here severe. Whereas again, afterwards, a large number this time is free, mild, nobody was moderate, and fewer now had severe symptoms. And once again, the same thing with this time, the complaints segregated into what could be called mental psychic, presumably referring to the changes in behavior, irritability, etc. And again, nobody was free of symptoms, and the vast majority of this category were reporting severe. Now it's the very opposite. The majority were reporting themselves to be free from symptoms, and the ones with severe symptoms have dramatically decreased. So this really demonstrates the efficacy of biogeometry. But something else that was interesting also happened. Ecological harmony was restored. First of all, and if you look at that news feature, one of the residents will talk about her plants, because plants had badly deteriorated under the effect of this electromagnetic radiation. However, especially the households of residents were now growing profusely. This is one symptom of, sorry, not symptom, this is one characteristic that you will get when you have harmonious BioGeometry flowing. The birds, which they noted now, before they had been worried because the migratory birds which stopped every year at the village hadn't stopped. Birds had left the area, even small animals that lived in the area like martins, etc. they had left, but now they were coming back in great numbers, more than before, and new bird species were also sighted. Harmony was restored on all levels. This is a shot of the mayor during the ceremony, which you'll see on the news feature, in which he thanks Dr. Karim for his contribution to the village. The residents were happy to experience relief, not only from their physical symptoms, but also on the level of inner peace and well-being, which also reflected in their interactions. This is a point which I will be slowly building up as we go along, because biogeometry doesn't just give release from stress in terms of the body, but also on these deep inner levels, which is why it makes it such a powerful method, especially for the times we're living in today. At the concluding ceremony, the mayor thanked Dr. Karim for bringing peace to their village once again. And before we move away from the Hamburg project, another quotation from this booklet, The Miracle of Hamburg, again by Ruth Chad, where she called it a mobile communication cellular tower that took the residents of Hamburg into a long dark night from which several lights came to shine. I like the analogy. It's quite apt for biogeometry. And as I showed you, this is the Hamburg emitter that you see. This is the modern version. It's no longer made of wood. The wood was because they were prototypes at the time. And we will talk about that when you get to do the advanced training. So now we have two studies, very interesting studies on biogeometry and Wi-Fi, reducing the detrimental effects of Wi-Fi. Now, something about Wi-Fi. Many people have now become accustomed to hearing about possible detrimental effects of cell phones and of 5G, because there's a lot of publicity on it, especially on the internet. But many people have not heard about Wi-Fi. What about Wi-Fi? Well, Wi-Fi is a form of radiation, and there have been studies which have found that prolonged exposure to Wi-Fi, which unfortunately is what we have, because maybe even if you have a router at home, whether it's in a home, an office, a cafe, a restaurant, a city, unfortunately, it's not a momentary thing, but it's a constant 24/7 exposure. And they were found to have effects, for example, on fertility and other aspects. Now, these are two studies. The first one was done by Khaled Fouad, and because they couldn't use people for these studies, they were obliged to use laboratory mice. And he studied the behavior of mice. Especially, this was focused on behavior of mice kept in enclosures, and he explored the effect of Wi-Fi and the effect of biogeometry in this way. So the first stage was study the behavior of mice under the influence of Wi-Fi, and study its effect again under Wi-Fi, but under the treatment of biogeometry. And this was done in Cairo. And the second stage was to study the pathological changes of mice on the brain, specifically on the brain, to confirm the validity of the results of the first stage. So the first stage, behavior, there was 4 tests. But the maze test for measuring spatial learning, the mouse's ability, how it was affected by Wi-Fi, its ability to negotiate a maze and remember where it passed from. Another form, elevated plus maze test, which measures more lines of anxiety. Swim test for measuring anxiety and depression. And the open field test for measuring locomotory activity and anxiety. And this was the experimental setup. One group was the control that you will have in any well-done experiment. The control, therefore, was a group of laboratory mice not exposed to Wi-Fi and no biogeometry involved, okay? And the second part, the second group was mice which were exposed to Wi-Fi. As you will see in a picture, they had the router placed between cages, but these only had the Wi-Fi, they did not have any biogeometry. They were the worst off, they didn't have anything to help them. Group C also had Wi-Fi, but this time they had a biogeometry shape placed close to their cages. If I'm not mistaken, the shape in question was actually used in terms of the cube, which you already have from your home kit, which you have a lifetime to discover just how powerful that cube is, okay? And the fourth group, that should be group D, who also had Wi-Fi, but instead of having a shape like the cube, their enclosure in which they were kept all throughout this experimental period was designed with biogeometry principle. Biogeometry principles of design is a very important chapter of biogeometry, and in fact you have an entire lesson dedicated to it, okay? We will see this later. So these are the results. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can see them in your own time. But with the maze test, results indicated low memory levels under the influence of Wi-Fi and high memory, again, after the intervention. So what Fawad demonstrated here is that the constant effect, bombardment, if you like, of the Wi-Fi radiation actually affected the mice's ability to retain memory. But biogeometry restored that situation back to the normal state. This is the other test, the elevated plus maze. Okay, it's a little more complex, but you can read in here. And this also had interesting results, the swim test, where the mice had to swim, as it were, out of necessity. And the results indicated that the mouse's ability and drive to swim, to save itself, was reduced with Wi-Fi. So the Wi-Fi almost, we could say, even reduced the will to live. And the mouse, in fact, showed more immobility, sort of freezing in place rather than moving to save itself. But it was restored closer to normal levels with the biogeometry interventions. Once again, compare it with what happens in modern society today. And finally, the last test, the open field test, results suggest that the motor activity rate is reduced by Wi-Fi, but approaches the normal state after biogeometry interventions. Okay, so here you have more results, which I'm not going to go into here, and a synopsis of the results. But basically, it clearly showed not only the detrimental effect of Wi-Fi, but more importantly, that there is a solution, and that's biogeometry. It can help restore behavioral, physical parameters closer to normal, to how it would be without the Wi-Fi. This is another study by Sharaf and a number of people here, including Mohammed Al-Sawi, who is involved in biogeometry as well. And I put them up here. You can read them in your own time. There is also the link where you can download it. It's in detail here, but it's pretty much the same situation, where you had mice exposed to Wi-Fi and mice exposed to Wi-Fi with biogeometry, apart of course from the control. In this case, they're showing some of the shapes that were used. As you can see, there is a form of the Hamburg emitter. There is another form which we don't use so much today, and there is something called the corner stand. I'm afraid in the document the JPEGs are a bit squashed, but you'll see better pictures later on. And also the cube was used. This cube looks a bit different from yours because it's an older version. And here there were also pathological studies done on the actual cells and the tissues to determine the damage by the Wi-Fi. but similar kind of results. The experimental session, once again, we have controlled 6 rats in a separate room, away from any electromagnetic waves, no biogeometry. Then the group of rats under the effect of Wi-Fi, 24/7 for 17 weeks, so it was done with a good time span, but no biogeometry. And group 3, same situation, but exposed to the biogeometry shapes. And if you read in detail the conclusions, you will see not only that this was yet another research, even apart from those outside of biogeometry, that demonstrated how Wi-Fi actually can have an impact on rats' brains. Okay, well, I'll leave it up to you to decide if it affects rats' brains, what does it do to ours. But most importantly, we always have to focus on the positive right here. Most importantly is that biogeometry is an effective solution for these effects. It can help nullify that effect that normally the Wi-Fi would have. And in fact, in the conclusions here, Sharaf and his team wrote, these biogeometrical shapes succeeded in reversing the aberrant effects of the Wi-Fi router radiation. Conclusively, this investigation shed light on the positive protective role of biogeometrical shapes against the detrimental effects of Wi-Fi radiation on the rat brain. Hence, it is mandatory to proceed with intense studies on this issue. And we hope there's going to be more in the not too distant future. Okay, now we're going to pass to another subject which concerns us all, harmonizing the detrimental effect of mobile phones. I think if not all, most of us carry mobile phones today. I carry a phone, I use a tablet, because our approach here is not to consider electromagnetism as the enemy, but to learn to use it, because electromagnetism is our friend as well. Let's face it, if it wasn't for electronics, for technology, you and I wouldn't be having this interaction here. You wouldn't be following this course. I wouldn't be talking to you, etc. So there's huge potential for learning, etc. So let's look at mobile phones. So first here we have a test that's a little bit old, but it still is very important, because after all, mobile phones are mobile phones. And here we see these were tests carried out on a subject. After using the mobile phone for 1 minute, they showed a reduction in the head temperature when using biogeometry interventions. So the point being that, as you may have heard from studies done on mobile phones, one of the problems is when you use it, it actually raises the microwave effect, has a microwave effect basically on the brain, and that raises the temperature, and that thermal effect is very important. Now, there was a test, a control test, where this person was using a phone with no biogeometry interventions, and the spot temperature was 34.1 degrees centigrade, as you can see with the infrared equipment there. Now, the first test then was using a phone, the same person using a phone with biogeometry products worn on the body. This would refer to the medallions, for example, we have, or the ring, etc. And we see that the spot temperature now has come down to 33.3 degrees centigrade, which is quite significant. The second test, this time, the biogeometry effect was brought about by shapes in the room. Once again, that would refer to something like the cube, for example. And we see it going down to 33, and this time using a phone, which actually has a chip, biogeometry chip attached to it, which I will show you later. You can buy these easily. And we see the temperature also went down to 33.4. So clearly, biogeometry worked against these thermal effects, which normally are cited as an indication of detrimental effect. Now here we have a more dramatic test, a more recent one too. This one uses this equipment you see here, known as an ETA scan, ETA. Now the ETA scan, as you can see here, it actually plots, it shows points in the energy flow on the head. They are like meridians, not necessarily the same ones we're accustomed to, but energy flows all over our body. That's part of what keeps our body alive. And this, therefore, the ETA scan is plotting a number of points in the head, and measuring their energy flow. Now, if we look at the legend here, we see that where you see yellow, the yellow circles, those are points of high energy. That means the flow is totally free and uninhibited. Where you see the red triangles, and there's quite a few of them, that is medium energy. Not quite full, but not low either, medium. The worst are when you see black. That's because it's low energy, meaning now it's blocked or it's disturbed. And here in the control normal state, we see that this person did not have any black. The majority are, well, on the sides, the majority are red, but if we see it from the top, now the top view, we see that there's a lot of healthy flow as well. Now, let's see what happens when this man uses a mobile phone, no biogeometry, just a normal mobile phone for just 5 minutes. Watch what has happened now. We see that the yellow points have dramatically decreased, but more to the point, the medium energy, which were like the normal, now have almost entirely disappeared, and they're being replaced by points of low energy, which means disturbance. This clearly shows very clearly how the mobile phone is actually shutting down, compromising very seriously, debilitating the energy flow through these conduits in the head. Now it gets interesting though. Now we see the subject using a phone for 8 minutes, which means longer than what we have here. But the difference is this is a phone with a biogeometry chip on it. And this is the result. Now, if you compare this obviously to the previous one, the change is dramatic. What is more relevant is that it is more comparable with the normal state. So using the phone for 8 minutes, one can actually say it kind of didn't really have any effect on the flow of energy through the energy conduits, meridians in the head. In fact, at a recent seminar I had in class, somebody pointed out, was very observant, pointed out that you could actually count a little more yellow here than you could here, but let's consider that as negligible. Let's just say it brought it back to normal. However, it's good to realize that nothing is a magic wand, and although the BG3, as we call it, the harmonious energy that biogeometry produces, is having this beneficial harmonizing effect, nonetheless, when something stress factor like electromagnetic is constantly bombarding, then it begins to have a cumulative effect. And in fact, we see the cumulative effect because on the mobile phone, even with the BG chip, after 10 minutes, we see that the strain is still being felt because a number of the yellow now have become red. But at least it still shows the power of the biogeometry because we do not have any black. And that's a full 10 minutes call. Okay, so I think this is very eye-opening exercise, not only as to the effect of mobile phone on our brain function and our energetic function in the head, but also, more importantly, on how biogeometry can be a solution to offset that effect and restore harmony, which is what we do in biogeometry. Something about radioactivity. There have been, as you can read here, there have been projects done, but most of them, Dr. Karim was privately commissioned, and there is non-disclosure agreement, so therefore, we cannot have so much details on those projects. However, there is one that we can talk about, and this research was part of Dr. Karim's thesis for his master's at Cairo University and done at the National Research Center of Cairo. Dr. Karim procured building material samples, which means things like ceramic tiles, paints, concrete, granites, etc., which are used in the building industry in houses. Many of us have these ourselves, right? He found, surprisingly, a relatively high incidence of radioactivity was found in many samples. So he devised this experiment where he built 6 rat cages, containers with an open top, using these radioactive materials. Okay, so specifically using materials which normally are even used in our houses. 3 normal cages were built for the control rats here, again, this is the usual control. Rats are healthy, nothing was interfered with. They were normal cages, not built from radioactivity. Then there was test set A, which was 3 radioactive cages made of material, and test set B, again 3 radioactive cages, but these had the cube. These poor fellows here didn't. And as you can see the results, that after 2 weeks, the control samples did not have, sorry, something just fell. The control sample did not have any signs of lesions or problems. And then in the first test set, which were inside radioactive cages from radioactive material, after 2 weeks, they had swollen lymphatic glands. After 8 weeks, these had damaged liver, kidney, and lung tissues. But the ones who had the radioactive cages, so to all intents and purposes, they should be suffering the same problems as set A, they were totally healthy, but the difference was they had the cube outside their cage. So it's a very interesting test here. There's more data there, which you can see in your own time. And here's some more microbiology research at the Cairo National Research Center. And 2 particular tests here, the Saccharomyces growth cessation experiment, and most important one, the hepatitis C. The Saccharomyces experiment was a kind of an informal experiment, which nonetheless left a huge impact with the head of the research center, in which Dr. Karim was given a petri dish with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, bacteria growing in it, and by simply drawing certain shapes, he halted the reproduction of these bacteria. So literally, they stopped reproducing, which is quite dramatic. Okay, it was just done as a demonstration of how biogeometry can have an impact on at the biological level, quite dramatically too. This is in fact a quotation from the report by Professor Badr Eldin, the head of the Department of Microbial Chemistry, where he said, in a preliminary experiment in my laboratory, quite a noticeable cessation of growth of Saccharomyces was observed during the initial 3-hour growth of the organism. And then he said, to me, the essence of this type of interaction seems to surpass explanation through our traditional and classical knowledge in basic science. Okay, but perhaps the more important one is the hepatitis C project. This was a nationwide study, a nationwide project all over Egypt. And the objective was to study some of the more popular remedies, which were pharmaceutical, against hepatitis C, in order to assess which one was perhaps more potent than the others. And they decided to also include biogeometry, so all the other factors in the study were these pharmaceuticals, and then there, of course, there was biogeometry. In the first stage, throughout 6 months, the biogeometrical chips with biosignatures were given to 300 persons, because biogeometry, of course, did not have something to be ingested like the pharmaceutical solutions had. It simply had a kind of a makeshift medallion with biosignatures, which people had to wear all throughout the test period. The results were an astonishing 90% normalization of enzyme levels, which was much higher than anything else tested. Yes, it actually surpassed the effect of the pharmaceutical drugs against hepatitis C. Dr. Khalif announced the results on national Egyptian television. Although not all participants were tested, a large number of participants also showed clearance of the microorganism. This was a very, very important study, very dramatic too, because it shows how biosignatures can have an impact on pathogens in the body. How was it achieved? Well, this is the solution that, this is the solution that was done. Here you can see that instead of using a medallion like the normal medallions we use today in biogeometry, which you see depicted below, what was used was the material from an electronic circuit board, because one could engrave the forms on it. And perhaps it had a benefit because people, when they were given this, they didn't look at it as something esoteric, which can then, one could then be accused of placebo effect being provoked in these people because they're seeing something esoteric. But they're seeing something which might look more technical. So the biogeometry solution was a chip with various biosignatures engraved on its surface. The selection of biosignatures reflected the body systems normally affected by hepatitis C. So there were obviously biosignatures for the liver, but as always, we always also like to include in any equation with biosignatures, we like to include biosignatures, for example, for the heart, because anytime there's disease, the heart has to work harder to support the systems mobilized to heal the disease, and the brain, which afterwards is the controller of everything. And what you see below here is an example of the modern biosignature medallions that we have. This is actually not the latest model, but we will discuss that later. But the point here being made is that the modern medallions contain what I like to call a cocktail of different biosignatures for the brain, for the heart, liver, stomach, kidney, the spine, for protection, you know, mental and psychic levels, spiritual biosignatures, etc. Okay, we'll see those later. Now, projects about agriculture. And there were two projects here which we're going to discuss. One was a small but immensely powerful experiment, which we hope we will have more of in future, the saltwater planting experiment done in Egypt. And the other one was done, part of a university project, in an apple orchard in Netherlands. Okay, so let's look at the effect of biogeometry on agriculture. Now, the saltwater planting experiment, in previous experiments, biogeometry has already been shown to enhance plant growth. You can demonstrate this yourself once you have biogeometry, and increase shelf life of products. However, in 1998, the late engineer Delamar tested the possibility of using biogeometry to enhance freshwater plants to grow in salt water. Now, this is more than just an experiment. This is a very important implication when we consider in the third world how many communities, places like Ethiopia, etc., how many communities there are who, one of their big problems is that they live away, some distance away from freshwater sources. And you know, we've all seen these documentaries or seen these videos on the internet about these children who start their day in the morning, they have to walk miles actually with a container on their shoulders just to get fresh water for the family. That's how scarce water can be, let alone when there is a drought. So this has implications, because if certain plants which normally require fresh water could be planted in salt water, now maybe not for Ethiopia, but for communities which do not have access, easy access to fresh water, but have access to the sea, for instance. Okay, so the 2-month experiment was simple, but it demonstrated striking results which open many possibilities. Let's look at the preliminary results. So it was done with 3 sweet potatoes. So 1 sweet potato was planted in a container in the soil, and it was provided watered with fresh water. And as one would expect, the sweet potato in the fresh water survived. You can see the picture here. It's still alive. Okay, it didn't die out because it's being kept in soil and given fresh water. Now, the second sweet potato was planted in soil, but this time it wasn't given fresh water, it was given salt water from the Red Sea, which is considered among the world's most saline. The sweet potato actually shriveled from the first day. So you can see it on the screen. It doesn't look like a sweet potato anymore, and this is understandable because the process of osmosis due to the salinity would actually extract all the moisture from it. So, seeing such a dramatic result, if there is a third sweet potato that's also planted in soil and also given water from the same saline source of the Red Sea, one would naturally, logically expect the same result we have here. You would expect it to die out and be shriveled. Not this one. Now watch this one. This is the most important one, of course, because it has been given only salt water, but enhanced with biogeometry, which we shall see in a moment. And we see that the experimental sweet potato, not only it survived, it actually has more energy than this one in fresh water, because look, it's sprouting new life. We can only imagine how enhanced its life force, its energetic template was to have an effect like that. And this is a picture of the setup that was used. And starting from the bottom, we see the sweet potato A, the one that lived because it was giving fresh water. Above it here, we see the sweet potato, which didn't have much of a destiny because it shriveled from the first day, because it was obviously given salt water, not fresh water. And here we see the third sweet potato, the one that thrived and is budding. Now, this is what made it work. You can see that instead of a normal pot, it was placed in a pot with very specific angle shapes here. We will see that later because we actually have products that make use of the same shape here, but we'll talk in detail. We'll have whole sections on this later. You can easily do it yourself. Not only that, but the container in which the water was placed was also given that shape, as was the conduit, the trough, which shuttled the water from the container into the sweet potato. So all that was done to have this effect is simply changing the shape of the containers of the sweet potato and the water. That's all. Okay? So a very powerful demonstration of biogeometry at its simplest, but at its best. This experiment was done with Professor Peter Mols of Wageningen Agricultural University in Netherlands. And it was done on these big apple orchards. And essentially, certain parts of the orchard were treated with biogeometry as opposed to others which were not. And then one could analyze the fruit from the normal orchard and from the biogeometrically treated orchard. And here is a little taste of this. We see 2 apples here, 2 apples here. These were the control, which means they were from the normal orchard. And these were the biogeometry ones. When I say from the normal orchard, this is not to say the orchard didn't give good apples, but these are apples which were left for a whole month in a central heated apartment at 21 degrees. We know what happens. No matter how fresh they are, eventually after a while they begin to, you get that caramelization, oxidation effect there. But not the biogeometry apples. Let's take a close up there. Look at the difference. We've all seen this before when we've had apples at home we didn't eat after a long time, but the biogeometry apples are still going strong exactly as if they were just picked from the tree. This clearly shows the effect of biogeometry was to enhance the life force. Okay. Talking about this, I'm reminded, perhaps some of you are familiar of the experiments done in Kerlane photography, where using special Kerlane photography, one could photograph a leaf and you get this kind of a haze around it. And then Kerlane discovered that if he cut one part of the leaf, took another Kerlane photo, you could still see the complete energetic template. It seems to be a template which then would be responsible for helping the leaf to repair, etc. The interesting thing is that there have been many debates after that experiment, because that was done back in the 60s, 70s, I believe, especially with people in modern times building a Kerlane camera, trying it with leaves, and it didn't work. Well, one reason it doesn't work is because they are using normal leaves, whereas it will work if you use a leaf that has been organically grown. But unfortunately, the effect of the contaminants in the air and the soil, and especially pesticides, they very much compromise the energetic template, what we call the blueprint. So now this is about animal husbandry, which were projects done with livestock, okay, especially cows, and oh yes, there was projects done with chickens as well. So the idea was to look into how animals could be given more healthy conditions, mortality lowered, etc. And this is a first project that was done in 2005 on a chicken farm. Essentially, this project consisted simply of placing colored plaques. You can see yellow ones here. There's a glimpse of a red one there, and there are blue ones here. colored plaques in certain places around the inside of the building. Now, I'm not going to explain it here. We have one whole lesson where you learn this technique, what we call the color placement technique. You can do it easily for your house. It has amazing results in a room. The difference is that in a house, because we give some attention to the decor, we don't use plaques like that. We use little adhesive, very small adhesive dots, which hardly become noticeable on the wall. In this case, of course, it was argued, probably correctly, that the chickens didn't really mind the change in the decor in the farm, so they used large plaques. Okay, and let's see the effect. Now you can see the figures here, but I will interpret it quickly visually like this. Now, the standard of growth for chickens internationally, so I am told, is that in 45 days, the maximum weight reached is usually 1.5 kilos. In Egypt, apparently, it's less, possibly because of the humidity, the temperature, whatever. But normally, chickens in 45 days reach a maximum weight of 1.25 kilos. Well, these chickens, which were in Egypt, in 45 days, they actually reached a whopping 1.85 kilos. Super chicken. And here's the important thing. Part of a very important parameter in the experiment was that these chickens, you see, for the experiment, an entire generation, those chickens you saw were bought by Dr. Karim in order to use them in the experiment purely for that reason. And you will see that whereas normally any chicken farm you find, unless it's a particular organic one, normally in the normal food industry, they receive hormones and they receive antibiotics and vaccinations. These chickens did not have any of those. All they had was biogeometry. And see with your own eyes the tremendous effect that this had. A more modern project, similar, took place in 2014 in Montreal, again in a chicken farm, as well as in a poultry farm with the Farmers Cooperative of Montreal. Unfortunately, these are modern times where these projects were done as a commission, and there were certain non-disclosure agreements, so we do not have details that can be shared. However, suffice it to say, the results were just as dramatic, in some cases even more dramatic, especially by the way the mortality was improved, despite the fact that these animals, these birds and these cows, were not being given hormones or antibiotics. So it kind of flew into against the paradigm, where the industry thinks that it feeds them antibiotics to keep them healthy. Okay, this is just one little graph here, which you can see. Here we see a sight you'll probably never see, a cow wearing a biosignature medallion. Okay, so we will move depart from that subject. This is a little mention of experiments with Dr. Masaru Emoto. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dr. Emoto and his book Messages from Water, where he explored how projecting emotion onto samples of water and then testing the crystals of the water, one could see very distinct changes in the crystal becoming more whole, more integral when harmonious vibrations were given, as opposed when disharmonious words or thoughts were imposed on it. Now, Dr. Masaru Emoto did a similar kind of experiment when he went to Egypt and cooperated with Dr. Karim, as you can see here, but this time using biogeometry. So this is a crystal of standard tap water, okay? And look at the water then after it was exposed to the cube in the room. And once again, same kind of cube you have, only the one used was much older, less powerful than the one you have. The one you have obviously is state of the art. At the moment, it even has protection against 5G, which wasn't invented at the time. In fact, you can see here the cube even had cut corners. It's just modifications in the design always happen in biogeometry, as Dr. Karim discovers more and more. So we can see clearly the effect the cube and biogeometry had on the water crystals. Now we come to a very, very important section indeed. This is biogeometry applications in autism and mental stress. I'm sure I don't need to tell you why this is important, because the incidences today of people, especially children, being born in the autistic spectrum is dramatically increasing. ADHD is all over the place. And of course, mental stress is increasing everywhere because of the conditions of the fast modern society and the electronic modern society. And we will look at 3 studies here. One done specifically on ADHD children by Dr. Dina Howady. Another was how serotonin levels in the brain, which are normally dramatically reduced by stress. This one was not done on children, but was done on rats because it was not permissible to use people for this experiment. And we see how biosignature, one single biosignature, restored the serotonin levels much more than prescription pharmaceuticals did. This was in Cairo 2014. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about a special project that is in the offing. So first, the study by Dr. Howady. In a controlled experiment at the Human Development Center in Saudi Arabia, 64 children were divided into 3 groups. And each group was studied by a psychologist and a neuropsychologist, and psychometric reports were prepared. So as always, one group was a control. The other 2 groups, the intervention of biogeometry was in how biogeometry was applied to the interior spaces that they were occupying. And what essentially were used was, once again, the cube, the strips, and certain principles of design. And each group was then evaluated for 3 months and various parameters studied, as we shall see. And what was observed was a distinctly higher improvement rates resulting in the 2 groups which had the biogeometry interventions. So we see Dr. Howady's data here. These are the variables that were tested: focus and attention, communication, behavior, teamwork, etc., etc. Okay, and here I'm not going to go into detail into it. You can see them in your own time. You can see the comparisons in the 2 bars of the graph each time in the different stages, without biogeometry, with biogeometry, for instance. Okay, and yes, and the fact is that here in the 2 stages, when the biogeometry interventions when applied, the children showed distinctly better results of improvement when compared to the control stage. So now we pass on to the second experiment. This is one of my favorites. I think it's mind-blowing. This was done at the medical department of Mansoura University in Egypt. And once again, 6 cages containers with the rats. Now, cage 1 was a control. Nothing was done to the rats, no biogeometry, no nothing. Whereas all the other 5 cages, the rats were stressed. You know, a certain degree of stress was generated in the rats. Well, you know, we talk about the rat race, and obviously our rat race is more stressful than the rats probably usually is. But in this case, the rats experienced a bit of stress themselves. Now, cage 2 was a control. The rats were stressed but had no biogeometry intervention. Okay, cages 3, 4, 5, and 6. The rats were all stressed, but cage 3 had 1 pharmaceutical antidepressant applied. Cage 4, a different antidepressant. Cage 5, a mix of those 2 antidepressants. And cage 6 was, of course, our favorite cage, because the stressed rats had no pharmaceuticals applied, but a biogeometry depression biosignature. Literally just 1 form drawn with a pen, which you have in your collection. You'll be using this as much as you like. And it was hung outside of the cage. Apparently, the story is that the experiment which Dr. Shekhar designed was meant for the biosignature to be on a card and placed inside the cage. But the rules of the university was that she could not set the experiment up, she could design it, and the university laboratory staff then put together the experimental setup, which obviously makes it a little even more authentic for us. And apparently the laboratory technician who was putting it together, he got the idea, quite rightly, that if these rats were going to be stressed, first thing they would do is chew on this card inside. So he stuck the card outside the cage. which makes it even more dramatic because that means the biosignature was not even in their visual field. It was simply in the ambient energy, which adds credence to the theory that we believe is at the heart of these phenomena, the theory of the radiesthesists, of what are known as shape-caused waves. But we will discuss the techniques later, as we said. Let's see what happened. When serotonin levels in the brain were tested, the results of cage 6 compared very favorably with those in the cages treated with pharmaceutical drugs. This demonstrated the efficacy of biogeometry biosignatures in treating stress and raising serotonin levels in the brain. If you look at this table, it says it all. So this is the first cage, the control. The rats were not stressed, here it calls it depressed, were not stressed, nothing was done. So what you're seeing here is a picture, a profile of the normal serotonin levels in the average kind of serotonin levels in a normal unstressed rat. Now here, this is the first control where the rats were stressed, but they had nothing administered to help them. And you can see a dramatic decrease in serotonin levels. We could say quite safely it went down by about 50%, didn't it? More or less, 40 to 50%. Now, here come the interesting ones. So if we look at these first, we see that with the different pharmaceuticals, look at how the serotonin levels changed, compare them to this. You can see that, yes, they went up from the stress level here, but they did not come anywhere close even to the control, especially this particular one. But now look at this table, which is the most important. This one is of the stress rats with only a biosignature. And you can see that the levels compare quite favorably with the pharmaceuticals and also with the control. But let's please remember here that we're talking about simply having a shape outside the cage. No substances were administered, nothing. Again, a very dramatic testimony to the power of biogeometry. In fact, Dr. Shaker got her PhD on this experiment. Now, this is a project which is, at the time of writing, is still in the offing because the permits from the Egyptian government are still being awaited. It was designed, it's a special center, quite a big one, as you can see from the design. It is designed to be a complex, an entire complex, which can help children with special needs in the sense that their parents could bring them there, and the center would have entertainment places, swimming pool, shopping center, and there are even apartments where people could rent or even actually live in a place like that. But the important thing is it's all biogeometrically designed to have positive impact on the brain activity of these children on the autistic spectrum. Okay, this is just some of the designs. We don't have much to tell you because it hasn't really been built, not yet. However, an initial test was done by Dr. Karim in the premises near his office in Cairo. As you can see, he constructed this wooden framework here. Let's call it a pavilion. It's all very carefully designed with angles according to biogeometry principles. Now, as a preliminary test, Dr. Karim invited parents with autistic children to bring them there and spend time under the canopy with their children, relaxing, playing. The results were quite dramatic. The parents were immensely impressed because during the time that they spent there and afterwards, the children began to respond in ways that brought them more able to interact in an everyday fashion, so to speak. So in a sense, it reduced the usual social challenge that some of these children were experiencing. Dr. Karim, was quite struck because it is that there were parents in tears watching their children undergo this. And in fact, they observed that the effects would be that for every 1.5 hours spent under the pavilion, the effects would last about 24 hours. That's quite dramatic. And Dr. Karim, in fact, was so struck that today it has become a new benchmark for all biogeometry products that he produces, that they also have not just to produce the BG3, as we shall see, but also have to have positive impact on the brains of children on autistic spectrum, etc. So this is something in future we shall be seeing more of. And what we see here is an interesting response to this experiment, because one of the responses he got from the parents was, this is amazing, but it's frustrating, because what can we do? We can't build a pavilion like this in our house. So Dr. Karim began to design this light fitting here. This is designed as a light fitting, which one could put in any room as the main light fitting, and it would offer the same energetic biogeometry benefits of the pavilion. Right now, it's not in production yet because it's still being tested with different light bulbs. It works. Geometrically, it works, but different light bulbs emit different frequencies, etc. So the tests that are needed are to ensure that the biogeometric beneficial effects will work regardless of what kind of light bulb the person places in the fitting. Now we come to another section, research on reducing electrosmoke stress in cars and their drivers. Well, two tests were done here. One was done at Elite Rent, a company in Geneva, which rents out cars, chauffeur-driven cars, luxury cars, usually. And the other one was an experiment done on the Formula One, as we shall see. Now, the pilot study at Elite Rent, the setup was this, that there were 4 Mercedes S-Class limousines, nice cars here, which had no biogeometry intervention, normal control cars. The other 4 had installed inside the biogeometry cube. It was placed inside in a way that it affected the car, but it was not visible. So, you know, it wasn't the case that the drivers knew what was going on. They didn't, but there was the intervention. Now, 8 drivers drove the cars alternatively for 8 to 12 hours every day, a normal workday, but not knowing which cars were modified. And at the end of each day, they had to fill in questionnaire to assess how they felt, their health condition, etc. The fact that they didn't know which car they were driving, if it was treated or not, helps against the placebo effect that one would imagine if you know, they knew about the cures. But results of the questionnaires showed a marked reduction in symptoms of stress and health problems. So there was a pattern observed, a correlation between the drivers who had the biogeometry cars, to call them that, and the drivers who did not. Okay, the levels of stress were markedly less in the drivers in the biogeometry cars. Now, before actually we talk about Formula One, just a little note, we will be talking about this in detail, but what was just described in those cars is very important today, because modern cars are getting dramatically more detrimental and stressful for the drivers. Firstly, well, not firstly, actually, it's all because of the electronics in them. The electric cars, well, you know, they don't have diesel emissions, petrol emissions, but they have EMFs, because as the driver, you're sitting on a large 400 kilo battery. You can imagine that it's going to have EMFs. But even if we do not look at the electric cars, even modern cars, any car, normal diesel or petrol car you buy today, it has so much electronics. Today they have GPS, they have internet capability, apart from the radio, even the seat sometimes in a more luxurious car. Some cars actually have up to 40 electric motors in the seat to do all the adjustments that you might need. So it really pays to think about harmonizing your car. And we have strips specifically to do that. So this study here was designed to reduce driver stress in Formula One cars, because the powerful engine, as soon as it starts, there is a surge of EMR, electromagnetic radiation, on the driver, which can affect the driver. So they decided to explore this. And here you see there's all the details of the experimental setup. And the driver who was used was the one you saw, was Rami Seri. He's known as a champion Formula One driver in Egypt. He's being set up with biofeedback equipment here on the heart, on the brain, the skin, etc. Okay, and these are pictures of the experiments supervised by Dr. Karim, the cube, and the type of parameters that were used in the measurements with the biofeedback equipment. And here we see without and with biogeometry, and there is the effect basically was an increase of delta brainwaves, but delta brainwaves are the deepest, most profound states of being that we can have. In fact, normally your average person experiences delta only when they are in deep sleep. However, if somebody is involved in deep spiritual practice or deep meditation, they can reach delta even when they're not sleeping. So increase of delta, which indicates relaxation, and the decrease in the beta level, as it's known, where it touches the alpha, which indicates less excitation. Okay, and increased oxygen saturation, etc. So that was successful as well. More details here, which you can read in your own time. And finally, we come to the last section, another old experiment, similar one to one we described before, this time using infrared testing to evaluate the effect of different applications of biogeometry. The infrared emanation was measured on a point on the forehead between the eyebrows. The initial control temperature was 35.8, and we see how with different biogeometry items, the temperature had a marked decrease, whether the person was wearing an L pendant or a biosignature pendant, or even with the eye cup pendulum, using it like a necklace, because it is an emitter of, with the color placement, the technique we talked about, putting dots on the wall, etc. You can see the dramatic decrease in that. Okay, so what we have to finish with are just some illustrations here, just to show you the kind of diversity of techniques and experiments done. These were special emitters. You can see the very different shape. They're not like any emitters that are available today. They were custom made for special projects. These emitters are actually stuck, embedded in concrete, covered with tubes to protect them, and this would then be buried in the ground, and makes use of the Earth energy grids in order to harmonize a radius of several miles. Similar projects that were done in the Middle East. We see Syed Karim there, heading out on a helicopter in remote areas to put these underground emitters there. Application of biogeometry in large ships. So yes, even ships have been treated, as well as airplanes. In fact, after doing this technique, Dr. Karim, this experiment, Dr. Karim would advise people, he said, if you have a choice, don't sit in the window seat. He said, because I've had the opportunity to see the panel of an airplane with the panel removed, and you can see all the wiring that you're sitting here. If you do travel, I travel a lot, obviously, to teach. I'm never without my protection, my medallions. Okay, it makes a huge, huge difference. We'll talk about that subject. And finally, this is to show you, this is one of the equipment that is used in biogeometry to measure sometimes at the biogeometry office. I mean, I don't have it, we don't have it, but Dr. Karim uses it to measure. It's called the biopulsar biofield imaging systems, and it can measure the different organs, the different parts of the body, the energetic profile, how it's being affected without the biogeometry, with the biogeometry. A lot of these parameters we're talking about are parameters not studied in conventional medicine or science, because unfortunately there is still that reliance on parameters which are more empirical, okay, measurable in a laboratory, etc. Whereas here we're talking about the energetic, subtle energy levels, which are extremely important, all the more because science ignores them, doesn't think that they're there, and therefore we are unaware that our new technology is having devastating effects on us on those levels. Okay, more tests. Okay, and finally, this is just to show you tests also even on items which you can buy today. This is one of the popular biogeometry items. I heartily recommend it. You shouldn't be without one. The Series Odyssey CD. We will talk more later what it does, what it is, but just to show you how, you know, a lot of tests are done even on the brain to see the effect without it, with the music after 3 minutes. etc. And what happens in the areas of the brain, the Brodmann areas, angular signal, gyrus, etc. And just to give you an example of how much testing is done. Okay, well, that ends our lesson for today. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a tour of biogeometry and how far it can take you. And from here, you will pass on to lesson 1B, which starts the actual theory, the concept learning. And lesson 1B is going to deal with biogeometry and qualitative science. This dwells on the last comment I made about conventional science being mainly focused on empirical measurements. This is, therefore, we can say modern science is a quantitative science, whereas biogeometry is a qualitative science. We work with different energy qualities, measuring the different energy qualities, which is a whole science in itself, and we will have an introduction to that science. Okay, so see you in lesson 1B.